This lecture is about the history of web design. In this lecture, we look at how technology has influenced design over the last 27 years and how design has influenced technology. By setting web design paradigms in their historical context, I hope to better illustrate why we do the things we do in web design and why people can make quite simple errors that they shouldn't do. For instance, using tables for layout instead of using CSS. To better illustrate what I'm talking about, you can actually visit an archive of websites that was begun in 1996 by the Internet Archive, a not-for-profit venture in San Francisco. In 2014, it had archived almost 9 petabytes of data and was receiving an additional 20 terabytes each week. And that is an enormous amount of information. So please visit this website to have a look at your favorite website in the current day, but also in the past, and you'll be able to see how web design has changed over the years. The lecture will be divided into 3 parts: the 90s, the beginning of the web, the 2000s, and in recent years. We'll start by looking how websites were initially designed in the 90s, how early technology constrained design, and how people first approached design on the web. Web design has a relatively short history compared to the other types of design, such as communication design with branding, book designs, packaging, and magazine designs. Tim Berners-Lee, a scientist at CERN, proposed a global hypertext project, later known as the World Wide Web. Between 1991 and 1993, the pages were text only, but in 1993, the Mosaic browser was invented. On 30th of April 1993, CERN announced that the World Wide Web would be free to anyone with no fees due. This made it different to other hypertext platforms of the time. The web actually wasn't the only way to convey data like this on the internet. The non-proprietary nature of the World Wide Web and the introduction of the Mosaic browser created huge interest in this technology and blew the competitors out of the water. Mosaic allowed for visual layouts, not just text-heavy pages. In 1994, the W3C was created to ensure common protocols so that content and browsers could be interoperable, ensuring that no one company would have a monopoly on the web. They still lead the developments of the web today. The purpose of the early web was for researchers to share their research papers, which is why a great deal of the early HTML tags focused on document design, such as headings, subheadings, paragraphs, links to other pages, and tables. And here's an example of an early web page in the Mosaic browser. As web pages were intended for text and tables, there was little thought to how designers could create visually innovative and attractive designs. The way they worked around this was to use tables for layout instead of tabular data. This method is antiquated, defies usability and best practice, and you should never do it for a web page design today. The idea at the time was to slice your image up in a graphics editing program such as Photoshop so that your design would neatly fit into the cells of a table. You would then create your table in HTML and position the slices of the design accordingly. This example is from the Space Jam website, designed in 1996 and still online for the sake of posterity. This is Microsoft's first website. You can see how the design defies the table layout that drives it. You can see that the color limitations are there. Colors on the web are displayed as hexadecimal triplet, or a hex code. This consists of 6 letters or numbers in 3 sets of pairs representing red, green, and blue channels. Back in the 90s, designers were restricted to 216 web-safe colours. In 8-bit processing, there are only 256 colours, and only 216 were guaranteed to display the same across all computers. As people were new to the web, conventions were created and rigorously adhered to so people knew how to interact with this new medium. The default links in HTML are underlined blue text. Even when the colour is changed by the designer, you note that they kept the underline, otherwise people wouldn't know what text was a link. This is why HTML and programs such as Axia RP still use blue underlined text as the default style for a hyperlink. In the first decade of web, people invariably viewed sites on a limited variety of desktop computers, which had a predictable set of resolutions. Most computers were 4:3 aspect ratio with a resolution of 800 by 600 pixels. Web designers often created websites with static or fixed measurements. For example, a central content area that was 640 pixels wide. This gave great control over the layout, but it meant the layout would not adapt if the browser window shrank or if the user was on a smaller screen. People were learning to code in large numbers, and one of the biggest companies of the time was Sausage Software, founded in Melbourne in 1995, who created a simple HTML editor they called Hotdog. Their website was one of the most popular of the day, receiving 250,000 hits per day in 1996. Designers weren't just restricted in colours, they were also restricted in fonts. In the mid-1990s, type designer Matthew Carter, commissioned by Microsoft, created Georgia and Verdana, two widely used typefaces for screen-based media. These typefaces were designed specifically for online viewing, with a large X height, open aperture and generous space. Commissioned by Microsoft specifically for text on web pages, both of these typefaces were designed first in bitmaps to match the pixels of the screen resolutions of the time, and then translated into outline fonts. In addition to Georgia and Verdana, the web could only display fonts such as Arial, Helvetica and Times New Roman, which are available on all computers. These are what we call system fonts. Fonts that are already installed on the user's computer that could be called up by HTML code. At this early stage, the only way to display another font with any reliability was to make a graphic out of it. This created an acceptable visual design, but it meant you couldn't click and drag to select the text. It couldn't be read by screen readers, meaning that the visually impaired were unable to use your site. And it caused problems for search engines, as automated bots could not read. We still rely on system fonts for websites. System fonts are early websites with large amounts of content are often based on frames. They're frame-based layouts, creating a maze of borders and scroll bars all packed into one little browser window. The primary reason for building pages like this was so that sections of content could be loaded separately. When you were dialing up all of your data over a 28K modem, every byte counted. So if you could load just one frame rather than the whole page, this would save time downloading. The rationale behind early websites was interesting. This was the .com boom, when companies all wanted a website but didn't quite know why. Pets.com raised $300 million US when it went public on the stock market, though it consistently lost money in selling pet supplies online. Few websites had a plan for making money beyond raising venture capital. Business owners were excited about the web but illiterate in its purpose or how to make money there. Companies often viewed it as being merely an online extension of traditional publications, with designers asked to merely put brochures online or create elaborate websites that functioned as little more than an online equivalent of a Yellow Pages ad, if you remember what the Yellow Pages were. In 1996, Flash, Future Splash at the time, was developed, allowing for greater interactivity but also requiring a plugin for it to work. Many developers resisted this at first as it defied the principle of interoperability, since users were locked into one plugin owned by one company. Soon, the usefulness of Flash overcame these concerns, and in 2009, Adobe claimed that 99% of the internet-connected computers had the Flash plugin, though this figure was controversial and highly disputed. Here's an example of a website created using Flash. Designers could break free of the use of tables for layout, so they discarded the grid for more organic layouts. Sweeping arcs and circles were popular, and Flash was used for elaborate splash page animations, button rollovers, and page transitions. Designers competed among each other for the most creative and visually spectacular websites, in the process ignoring the needs of the users. In these early years, Flash was not accessible to screen readers, meaning that the vision impaired could not use these sites, and users were often forced to sit through clever animations that had little to do with why they wanted to visit the website. You must remember that at this stage, most web users were relying on dial-up modems, so if the Flash file was too large, download times were very long. The solution for this was the loading bar. Many loading bars were simple, but some designers added a touch of branding or whimsy to the design. Why are these loading bars important? In 1993, Jacob Nielsen, an expert in usability, conducted research on how long users would wait for a computer to respond to a prompt. 0.1 seconds would make the user feel that the site was responding instantaneously. 1 second is required for the user's flow of thoughts to be uninterrupted. I need to buy flowers online. I need to buy, oh, look, a kitten. 10 seconds is the time limit for keeping the user's mind on the task. Otherwise, they'll leave to do other things. Providing feedback is important to keep the user's attention and also so they know where they are in the process. A loading bar lets them know when the page will be ready, and also that the site isn't broken and that they won't be waiting staring at a blank screen forever. Flash, however, was not destined to rule the web forever. Its dominance ended when Apple chose not to allow iPads and the iPhone to support Flash. Some of the reasons for the move away from Flash include security reasons. It uses a lot of operating resources, which could be a problem with laptops relying on prolonging battery charge. And the ability of HTML to do a lot of what Flash used to do means that it has been entirely superseded. According to Fast Company, 6 years ago, well now 8 years ago, 28.9% of websites use Flash. Now it is virtually zero. Developments in the late 1990s and early 2000s included the advent of WYSIWYG site builders. WYSIWYG stands for What You See is What You Get. They allowed people to build websites with no knowledge of code. Dreamweaver and Microsoft FrontPage were among the first. Suddenly you didn't need to be a web developer to create websites. WYSIWYG editors allowed people to make simple websites with no coding knowledge whatsoever. Online website builders allowed people to build their own site without any need for expensive software. GeoCities was a popular way for people to build a website. In the mid to late 90s, content management systems, or CMSs, allowed people to build their own sites online using web templates and ready-made back-end systems so that people could update their own dynamic content. As people were new to the web, designers relied on skeuomorphism to convey affordances or how to react with the design. Links evolved beyond underlined blue text to adopt metaphors for interaction. Buttons began being used, and to emulate real-world buttons, they had bevels, embossing, and shadows. You can see this reliance on skeuomorphism in most new technologies. For example, the early library in the iPhone looked like an actual bookshelf so that users would know what to do to interact with it. Designs in the late 90s and early 2000s commonly used faux 3D, with highlights, lens flares and shadows. Part of this was the excitement of using Photoshop, but also a futuristic enthusiasm toward the start of a new millennium. The 1990s was all about usability. Usability is simply the ease of use of a website. Don Norman with the Norman Nielsen Group developed the concept of usability heuristics for user interface design in 1995. Some key considerations of usability are information hierarchy. Can the user find important information? Wayfinding and way showing. Can the user find where they need to go on the website? Readability, the font choice, text size, line length and line spacing, and ease of understanding. Ease of understanding can involve writing the contents in simple English if the website is in English, and chunking information for better memory and comprehension. User testing is crucial in measuring the usability of your website. This can be done with heuristic methods or with time-to-task testing. Now we move to the 2000s. The year 2000 was big news in the world of web design. In 2000, the dot-com bubble burst. As you can see from this NASDAQ graph, millions were lost in a short amount of time, leading people to say that the web had been overhyped in the first place. However, in late 2001, O'Reilly and Live Media at a conference argued that the web was not dead. It was just changing form, and they first used the term Web 2.0 to describe this transformation. In Web 2.0, people did not just sit passively consuming content from the web, they actively co-created their own content with millions of other users worldwide. Rather than creating static GeoCities websites, people created blogs on which others could comment. Instead of downloading MP3s from mp3.com, they shared with others on Napster. Rather than using a CMS to manage their own site, they created wikis to collaboratively create content with others around the world. CSS, cascading style sheets, were developed in 1998, and by the early 2000s it was embraced as a way to style web pages. Now, tables were not required and indeed shunned for layout. Usability was more important than flashy novelty. Designs became cleaner and more simple. Before CSS, all style had to be embedded in the HTML. This meant that all pages and often elements had to be individually styled. If your client wanted you to change the font from Verdana to Times New Roman, you had to find every single font tag and change it yourself. With CSS, the style could be completely separated from the content with an external style sheet holding the visual information about all elements and pages in your website. If I needed to change the font, all I'd have to do is go into the style sheet and change that one instance to change all of my pages. The browser could read both the HTML file for the content and the CSS file for the visual style, combining the information to display the web page. This created lighter web pages and worked better with different technologies such as screen readers or printers, where the designer could create a separate style sheet for different media, or the user or device could substitute their own style sheet for ease of use. Now the accepted method of web design is to use CSS for all visual design of the site and only HTML for content. Importantly, this means that CSS can be used for the layout of pages, so there is no longer any need to use tables for layout. Good design in code wasn't just about reducing download times, it also supported accessibility, ensuring that your site is accessible to people with different needs. And we will be talking about this more in a future lecture, especially about how the Sydney Olympic Organising Committee was sued in the year 2000 for creating a website that was not accessible. As technology advanced, monitors became bigger and cheaper. Around 2001, medium-sized screens, 1024 by 768 pixels, became the norm. At this point, liquid layouts became the most popular way of designing a page. Rather than measure the width and height in pixels, liquid layouts used relative measurements of percentages. This meant that the main content of a web page would fill 80% of the width of the browser window, no matter how large or small the browser window was. If the browser window became smaller, the content would resize and flow around the new width. For a while, this was a great solution to the problem of different size screens and resolutions. By the mid to late 2000s, Web 2.0 had its own visual style with glossy images, gradients and reflections showing how sleek and cool everything could be. The message was friendly, shiny and very professional. With the new two-way dialogue of Web 2.0, attention moved from pure usability, where the focus was just on performing tasks, to the individual user's emotional experience while using the website. By adding emotional experience to usability and functionality, user experience design, or UX, sought to understand website design from a holistic point of view. The new viewpoint put users at the center, focusing on their needs and motivations. Some examples of bringing emotion together successfully with usability are the playful 404 messages created by some websites. 404 errors traditionally inform users of status and give a way out of an error. So 404, page not found. These examples add delight to an experience and can be done in subtle or simple ways. So we've got the example with Lego. We've got a Venn diagram of 404 for a magnet, a 404 page from GitHub, a 404 animated page from Dailymotion. It's not animated here though, and another one from Blizzard. Now we move on to more recent developments in the last decade of web design. Increased bandwidth means that many sites can now use large images in the background. Pictures evoke emotion more than flat, monochrome backgrounds, so they are useful in improving the user experience online. They provide visual interest and often convey information quicker than text. Design trends since 2010 have tended towards flatter designs, though Google Material now recommends very small, very subtle drop shadows to create visual layers. Design has moved away from the beveled, shiny, embossed buttons of yesteryear. Web fonts have allowed designers to break free of the restrictions of web-safe system fonts, and we will talk about this more during the week where we cover web typography. With an emphasis on user experience, single-page scrolling sites have become popular. These scrolling websites are popular because of the use of mobile devices, where it is easier to scroll down a page than click on a tiny link to go to a new page. Another development of the past decade is responsive design. Now people can access the web using more than a desktop computer. This means a range of window sizes, resolutions, and aspect ratios. Designers use responsive design so their design can adapt to any possible browser window width. Medium-sized screens were superseded by big screens around 2009. This would still work with percentage widths, but another trend began to create problems for liquid layouts. The move towards larger screens and higher resolutions was countered by the rising popularity of mobile devices. In the year 2013, we saw the tipping point where more people were accessing the web through mobile devices than desktop computers. So this is another reason why responsive design was so important. Adaptive layout was another solution that came about, and that means that there might be one entire design for a mobile phone compared to a desktop computer. So back when data was expensive for mobile phones, often the adaptive design that was specifically for mobile phones would not automatically have video in it. You would have to actually go to the desktop site to see the videos. So what will happen in the future? Importantly, the semantic web is still getting stronger and stronger. The idea of semantic web, or Web 3.0, is to ensure that all of the tags actually mean something, so a computer can understand the structure of a website. You don't need a human being to read it to know what the title is, to know what an article is, to know what a caption is. The Internet of Things is becoming bigger and bigger. By the year 2020, there is an estimation that there will be 50 billion objects connected to the Internet of Things. This leads to issues of security as well as issues of design. So that's the lecture showing the evolution of web design and how technology influenced design, but design also influenced the development of new technology. We will be covering many of these individual items in greater detail in future classes, but for now I hope this gives you a good overview of why design is done the way it is and how it has progressed over the years.